week on Bookmark, Ramona Caval talks to the man they call the king of sci-fi, writer Stanley Robinson on his recent visit to Melbourne. And from the Young Writers Weekend in Sydney, we meet some rising stars on the Australian literary scene. Hello and welcome to Bookmark. The man they call the king of science fiction is Californian writer Stanley Robinson. He landed in Australia last week as special guest of the Australian Science Fiction Convention in Hobart. The ABC Radio National presenter of books and writing, Ramona Caval, made contact with Stanley Robinson at Melbourne's science fiction bookstore Minotaur, where he was signing books for his adoring fans. American writer Stanley Robinson is an acclaimed master of the science fiction blockbuster. His book Red Mars was described as the War and Peace of science fiction. At over 600 pages long, it's just the first of a trilogy he's writing about the colonisation of Mars by Earthlings, or Terrans, and the technology, politics and philosophy behind terraforming, or making Mars a nice place for humans to live.
For thousands of years, Mars was a sacred power in human affairs, and its color made it a dangerous power, representing blood, anger, war, and the heart. Then the first telescopes gave us a closer look, and we saw the little orange disk with its white poles and dark patches spreading and shrinking as the long seasons passed. No improvement in the technology of the telescope ever gave us much more than that, but the best images from Earth gave Lowell enough blurs to inspire a story, the story we all know, of a dying world and a heroic people desperately building canals to hold off the final deadly encroachment of the desert.
Arthur C. Clarke has talked about your book Red Mars and said it was the best book on the colonisation of Mars ever written. Isn't it strange how people talk about your work as if it's a history rather than a piece of science fiction?
It seems to me that science fiction is slightly misnamed in that it's not strictly about science per se. What it really is a kind of future history. And so it is historical fiction in a peculiar way, since it's stuff that hasn't really happened, but it's like simulations, historical simulations, like computer simulations or weather forecast simulations, where you start off from this moment and you go off into one future or another. And every science fiction novel, if you look at it closely and read it, inside it there will be a history that draws it back to this moment with an implicit or an explicit message in there that if we do this, we will get to this spot. And so that makes it a kind of a political fiction at all points. And if you do it right and do it in a way that doesn't just go off into fantasy land, then you're always going to have that sense that you're reading history.
Could you tell us about the pull of the planet Mars for you? It's certainly a place that has spawned an enormous tradition of science fiction literature, hasn't it?
First of all, it's really there, and it's nearby. You can actually see it with the naked eye up in the night sky, and you can easily identify it because it's bright and it's red. And so it's not as if it's a complete fantasy. Once again, it's something that we can connect to in some real way. And the other thing is that ever since the late 19th century, we have been aware with these telescopes that there's things happening on Mars that look as if there were life on Mars. In the late 19th century, the best scientific evidence that we had said that there was possibly plant life that was darkening the planet's surface in summer and then receding in the wintertime. There were ice caps that you could very definitely see, so that implied there was water. And so now for an entire century, Mars has represented to us a chance that there's life elsewhere in the universe and that there might be intelligent life over there. And instantly, the moment they looked through that telescope, they almost as if it were spontaneously generated, they thought, aha, water, therefore life, therefore intelligent life, therefore perhaps they're in trouble because they don't have enough water. And this story was born, and it's gone on from there.
Is it difficult to create a fictional space in science fiction where you're asking the reader to suspend disbelief, you're taking them to a world that isn't part of the real world, that is so clearly a figment of your imagination?
It is a bit harder. There's somewhat of a technical challenge in that in a realist novel you could say, well, he crossed Manhattan in a taxi, and the reader can visualize that without many more clues, whereas if you say, well, he got into the, water flyer and dove under the water planet of X, then you have to provide a bit more clues along the way in order for the reader to be able to visualize that. So you have the technical challenge of exposition, which is one of the major problems facing a science fiction writer who wants to evoke these landscapes in people's minds. But on the other hand, the readers have this, it's a willing suspension of disbelief, and what I've found is that the will is incredibly strong.
But science fiction readers must really have a taste for what you might call clutter in the text. They really want you to tell them how things are working and why things are working, as well as the story.
Yes, I think that might be part of the craft of reading science fiction, an acquired taste, so to speak, so that if you came across it for the first time, you might feel that there's a slight slowness to the pace or that there's a lot of exposition. On the other hand, the tradition of the novel is really various, and some novelists will tell you much more about a scene than any science fiction novel would dare to do. I mean, there's a chapter in Proust that begins, and Marcel wakes up, he crosses the room, he looks down at the person selling vegetable in the street below, and that takes about 50 pages to describe. And I mean, Proust is a classic case of incredibly slow-paced fiction, but it's also very beautiful, and it's sort of it's shown what's possible. And in the novel, almost anything's possible if you can pull it off.
I'm glad you mentioned Proust, because I was going to say that books by writers like Orwell or Huxley have had more effect on the popular imagination than books by Proust or indeed Shakespeare.
Yes, this emphasis on the future, it means that these are stories about a place that we are still headed towards, and there are always comments on the moment and on the history that is going to head us in one way or another, so that if you set out as bold or a caricature like 1984 or A Brave New World of a future that is like a signpost saying, don't go this way, it has an impact on the popular culture that is quite enormous. Now, it would be good if Proust and Shakespeare had a similar impact on the culture, on its sense of values, on right and wrong, and I think we get our sense of values principally in this world through the stories that we tell each other, and therefore through fiction. And I think it's really important that way, and so writers who, as great as Proust and Shakespeare, the more read they are, the more impact they have on us, the better our civilization becomes. So it's not good that Huxley and Orwell have had a bigger impact on this century than Proust and Shakespeare, but it does seem to be the case.
One of the things that your readers are most impressed by is your ability not only to look at the political, philosophical and social issues to do with colonising Mars, but you're also spot on in so many areas of science: geology, astronomy, physics, chemistry. How do you do that research?
Well, it's time intensive. It took me a long time, and a lot of reading over many years. Also, I'm married to a scientist, a chemist, and she's a working scientist in a community of other scientists in the U.S. Geological Survey. So I not only have somebody I can answer questions, but also I get to watch the kind of sociology of science, how it works in the real world, how scientists think, which is really important for a novelist, because you'd like to get inside the mind of the scientist, and despite its name, that isn't something that science fiction has done all that much. So I have this advantage on the human side of things, which is nice because it's novels that I'm dealing with, not textbooks. And then in terms of the technical detail, it's to a certain extent it's a matter of stagecraft tricks, and I don't know if it's like a magician explaining a magic trick. I'm not so sure I really want to go into the detail all that much, because then you'll see my hands moving when you look at the page. But I mean, you can get the notion, you research it, you understand it for a minute, you write that down during the minute that you understand it, and you go on, and afterwards maybe you don't understand it anymore.
Well, both Red Mars and Green Mars are very long books, and Blue Mars is yet to come. You really are fond of the epic, aren't you?
It's been 6 or 7 years of my life, and really hard years in terms of how much work I put in. But it's a big story. It's really a planet, and I wanted to tell the story of a planet being terraformed and colonized by human beings, the start of a new society. It brings in all of these various elements that you talked about, and It took a big cast of characters to do it justice, and I sort of just kept on falling further and further into it, and never really planned for it to be this long. In fact, I intended it just to be a single novel called Green Mars, and when I started and I wrote 200 pages and they had just arrived at the planet, I realized that there really is going to be too long to do in one volume. So it's had to be this long, and the only thing I can say in its defense, because I know everybody kind of groans at the idea of 1,800 pages on anything whatsoever, is that it seemed to me that there was that much matter in it to be told, and really one of the technical questions was actually trying to compact that much stuff into one story of any length whatsoever.
And for your next project, I believe you're going to another Martian landscape, this time on planet Earth.
Yes, I'm going to the Earth's most Martian place, which is Antarctica. I got a grant from the National Science Foundation that will send me down there for a couple of months. I'm going to visit with scientists and be a science groupie, as I have been so often before, and watch them do their work and then concoct a science fiction novel about Antarctica in the next century, concentrating on these environmental issues which impact Antarctica so heavily. The notion of it as a world park versus the notion of it as a resource to be strip mined like we have everywhere else. So I've got a nice sort of precursor to the Martian situation to do next.
And now for some new releases. There's a new biography out of John Keats, just called John Keats Alive by Stephen Coote, who's also written biographies of Byron and other poets. Keats, of course, died in 1821 at the young age of 25, and he's kind of the epitome of the great romantic poet. This is a very unsentimental book about a very sad life. Keats gave us so many of the great odes and great poetry that many of us read from a very young age. The book talks about the difficulties of his early life in such a repressive society in England, and also about the way in which he was vilified by so many reviewers. He was called vulgar and even insane, which hurt him very much. But he had some great friendships, many of which are canvassed in the book, including with Shelley. And it was in fact a book of Keats's poetry found in the pocket of Shelley's jacket when he was found drowned off the coast of Italy, and they'd become great friends. The most moving part of the book is, of course, his last years when he had TB and he went to Rome. And he was very sad and had a very obsessive love for Fanny Brawne. And it's very interesting the way he seemed to think that he had TB because of his obsessive love. It was like, for many centuries, the way illness was used as a metaphor, as Susan Sontag has written about. It's a very sad book, but very unsentimental and a very good biography indeed. This book is totally different. This is called Spider Boys. It's a novel by Ming Shi. And this is set in Singapore in the early 1950s, in the aftermath of the Japanese occupation, when there was a lot of poverty and violence around. And it's basically about the street gangs in Singapore, and especially Kwang, the main character. And what the street gangs do is they breed spiders to fight, and they tease them and make them more and more venomous, and they even feed them bed bugs with their own blood in the bugs, and there's some sort of quite gory things. But often the boys go on then, it becomes a metaphor for the other sorts of violence that they go into. It's a very frank, straightforward, quite a hard-hitting novel. Ming Shi has a Chinese father and a Thai mother, and he was born in Singapore in 1947. He's travelled all over Southeast Asia since then and now lives in New Zealand. This is his first novel, published by Penguin, but it has also been picked up by William Morrow. It's a very interesting read about an unusual time in Singapore's history. Oceans of Consolation must indeed, I think, win the title for the most beautiful, the beautiful title of the year so far, Oceans of Consolation. It's written by David Fitzpatrick, and it's personal accounts of Irish migration to Australia. This has been done before by Patrick O'Farrell and so on, but Fitzpatrick's taken quite, he's an Australian who lives in Dublin. He's taken quite an interesting tack because he looks at just 14 families between 1850 and 1914, when about 1/3 Irish people migrated to Australia. And it starts off quite academically in his study. They're not just set out on the page, the letters. He puts them in context. And he follows the way their ideas of home changed, how it began to be Ireland, and then it was their house, and finally they began to call Australia their home. And it also looks at the pragmatic way in which Irish families had to approach migration. The title comes from a young man who went to the Hunter Valley in the 1850s and 60s, and he was waiting and waiting and waiting, as so many migrants have, for a letter from home, and he finally got one from his father, and he wrote back and said, "Your letter gave me an ocean of consolation," and no doubt that's a sentiment echoed by many migrants to Australia.